When I think of serial killers, I always imagine a visible monster, someone who stands out from the crowd, a villain with obvious signs. But what terrifies me the most, what truly chills my blood, is the possibility that this monster isn't so obvious. And that's the story of Dennis Rader, the man the world would come to know as BTK, a nickname that defined his brutality: bind, torture, kill. But the unsettling part of this case isn't just the atrocious nature of his crimes. What makes it truly chilling is the life he led in plain sight. Who would have thought that Dennis Rader, a married man, father of two, and president of the local church, was actually the person responsible for terrorizing the city of Wichita, Kansas, for more than 30 years? Imagine living in his neighborhood, perhaps having a trivial conversation with him at the store or asking him for a favor as if he were any other trustworthy person. Rader was the kind of man no one would suspect. He worked as a security supervisor, in charge of enforcing rules in his community. But behind that calm and responsible facade, there was a dark desire, an insatiable need for control and power. A man who seemed harmless, but in the privacy of his home, was planning his next steps to hunt, stalk, and kill his victims. For over 3 decades, he managed to maintain that double life. He appeared to be an exemplary citizen, a man involved in his church and caring for his family. How could someone like him deceive everyone for so long? This is where the horror of his story begins, not just because his crimes were heinous, but because his ability to hide in plain sight, to live among us, is what truly marks his story as one of the most disturbing cases history has ever seen. BTK wasn't the typical serial killer. He was the killer who lived among us. Dennis Rader's life, the ideal neighbor. What's most unsettling about Dennis Rader isn't just the nature of his crimes, but how he managed to maintain such a normal life in the eyes of his community. Rader grew up in a typical family in the quiet surroundings of Wichita, Kansas. No one would have imagined that this seemingly ordinary child, the eldest of 4 siblings, harbored dark impulses from an early age. He wasn't a troublesome child, nor did he draw too much attention to himself. His teachers and classmates described him as an average boy, perhaps a little reserved, but nothing out of the ordinary. And so his life continued, seemingly normal, as he grew up and integrated into society. When you think of the most notorious killers in history, you might imagine early warning signs, evident violence, social isolation, some clue that would make us understand what was to come. But Rader was different. He seemed like the perfect neighbor, the attentive father, the dedicated husband. There was nothing that stood out negatively about him. Throughout his life, he maintained an impeccable image, performing routine jobs, and what's even more surprising, being deeply involved in the local Lutheran church. Dennis wasn't just another parishioner. For years, he was the president of his church's council, a pillar of the community. Who would have thought that a man who helped organize religious events, who led community meetings, and who advised the youth, was also living a dark and terrifying double life? This is perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. While spiritually guiding his neighbors, he was also meticulously planning his next murders. Even in his family life, Rader appeared to be the typical suburban father. Married to his wife Paula since 1971, they had 2 children, and he seemed to lead a stable, uneventful home life. To his neighbors, he was a man who mowed his lawn, took his kids to school, and even participated in neighborhood watch activities. He was an exemplary citizen who cared about his surroundings and was concerned with community rules and order. But beneath that facade of normalcy beat a monster. While fulfilling his daily responsibilities, Rader also meticulously controlled his darkest impulses. He wrote about his violent fantasies and carefully prepared them. What's most disturbing is that his life as a killer wasn't the result of a moment of madness, but the product of years of calculated planning. For him, murder was a cold, methodical process, a way to gain absolute control over life and death. Thinking about this makes you doubt everything. How is it possible that a man like him went unnoticed for so long? Maybe it's because we all want to believe we can recognize evil at first glance, that there's something in the look or behavior that reveals monsters. But in the case of Dennis Rader, nothing was obvious. He was the neighbor who greeted you in the morning, the man who helped if your car broke down, the same person who sent you Christmas cards. Dennis Rader was the type of man you trusted, the ideal neighbor. And maybe that's what made him so dangerous. He wasn't just a killer, he was a master of manipulation. For years, he managed to deceive everyone around him, hiding his true nature behind a life that seemed, at least on the surface, completely normal. The birth of BTK, the killer who tormented Wichita. It's unsettling to think that behind the seemingly normal life Dennis Rader led in Wichita, Kansas, there existed an entirely different persona. Rader, the ideal neighbor and devout church member, was about to reveal his true identity, an identity that neither his family nor his co-workers could have imagined. The birth of BTK, an acronym that stands for bind, torture, kill, marked the beginning of a spiral of terror that left an indelible scar on the community. It all began in 1974, when Rader, a 29-year-old man, committed his first crime. But this was no impulsive murder. In Rader's case, his crimes were always meticulously planned. He himself described it as a game, a macabre hunting game where his victims were carefully chosen, stalked, and ultimately subjected to his dark impulses. That first crime was the massacre of the Otero family, a blow that shook Wichita to its core. I remember hearing about this murder for the first time, and the community's reaction was pure disbelief. How could someone enter a family home in broad daylight and commit such a monstrous act? But what was most terrifying was the precision with which he carried it out. Rader wasn't just any killer, he was a methodical predator, someone who planned every detail with cold precision. He terrorized his victims by physically and psychologically breaking them, fulfilling his sinister ritual: bind, torture, and kill. However, what set Rader apart from other serial killers was not only the brutality of his crimes, but his constant desire for recognition. He couldn't bear the thought that his acts would remain in the shadows, unknown to the public. So he began communicating with the media, sending letters to the police and local newspapers, describing his crimes in disturbing detail and signing them with the initials BTK. In these letters, Rader displayed his need for control and superiority, his craving to be seen and feared. It was as if those messages were an essential part of his process, a kind of trophy that brought him satisfaction. Imagine someone living a double life for so long. On one hand, attending community meetings, working a respectable job, and helping out at church. On the other hand, maintaining a macabre correspondence with authorities, taunting the police for failing to capture him. This duality is what allowed Rader to remain free for decades. No one could have imagined that the man they knew as Dennis Rader, the friendly and helpful neighbor, was actually the monster they called BTK. What's even more chilling is that Rader wasn't just a calculating killer, he played with the police and the media. In one of his letters, he brazenly asked, "How can I avoid getting caught?" It was an open challenge, a mockery of law enforcement that only heightened the fear in the community. BTK was everywhere and nowhere at the same time, and that's what made his presence so terrifying. No one knew who might be next on his list. Authorities were desperate to catch him, but for years, they couldn't find a single solid lead. BTK was like a ghost, appearing just enough to sow chaos, then vanishing before they could capture him. Wichita lived under a cloud of fear, and frustration grew as the crimes went unsolved. Each new murder seemed bolder than the last, and with every letter, BTK taunted those who tried to stop him. It's hard to imagine how a person could live with such duality. How could Dennis Rader, the man who smiled at his neighbors and attended community meetings, transform into BTK, the ruthless killer who bound and tortured his victims? Where was the line between his daily life and his horrifying crimes? We may never fully understand what drove him, but what is clear is that Rader didn't just enjoy the killings, he also relished the power he felt in manipulating an entire city. This phase of his life, when he became BTK, revealed the true face of evil. Rader wasn't just a serial killer, he was a master manipulator, a man who managed to keep two completely separate lives for years. His ability to hide his true nature while simultaneously playing with the psychology of Wichita is what makes him one of the most terrifying criminals in modern history. And yet, the real question remained unanswered. How could someone so close, so normal, be capable of such horrific acts? What drove him to become the monster who terrorized an entire city? The enigma of BTK, that dark duality between the perfect neighbor and the ruthless killer, would continue to baffle everyone long after his capture. The killer's escape, the years of silence. After years of terrorizing Wichita, Dennis Rader, the man behind the alias BTK, vanished as if swept away by the wind. He left no clues, no more taunting letters, no more mutilated bodies and homes shattered by fear. It was as if the killer had decided to abandon his macabre game and fade into darkness. But what no one knew at the time, what only Rader himself understood, was that his murderous impulse was still lurking beneath the surface, like a sleeping beast waiting for the right moment to strike again. I remember clearly how the city let out a cautious sigh of relief. After more than a decade of brutal crimes, nights filled with fear and anxiety, BTK had disappeared. Newspaper headlines no longer screamed about horrific murders and chilling letters. The police, who had been publicly humiliated by the killer, began to focus on other cases, and people gradually stopped looking over their shoulders. It seemed like the nightmare was finally over. But something inside me told me it couldn't be that simple. Would a serial killer with that level of control and obsession over power simply stop killing? Would he disappear just like that, satisfied with the crimes he had committed? That was the question many of us quietly pondered but never wanted to say out loud. Wichita had suffered enough, and the city needed to believe that the horror was behind it. During those years of silence, Rader continued with his normal life. He remained the man who smiled at his neighbors, the husband and father who sat at the dinner table with his family as if everything was fine. His ability to live a double life was impressive, and it was precisely this that made him so terrifying. Dennis Rader had not stopped being BTK, he had simply hidden it better than ever. Imagine for a moment what it must have been like for him to live through those silent years. Outwardly, he was an ordinary man, even rising to become a leader in his church and community. But inside, there was a monster lurking, a monster that still had control. What stopped him during those years? Why did he stop killing? Some say it was the fear of being caught. The authorities, though frustrated, never stopped investigating, and Rader knew that each murder increased the chances of him making a mistake. Perhaps it was that paranoia that made him pull back, forcing him to stop acting. But there are those who believe that those years of silence were a period of buildup. BTK hadn't disappeared, he was simply waiting, letting the tension build inside him until he could no longer contain it. Those years of apparent calm only deepened the mystery. It was as if the city of Wichita was living in a silent truce with its own demon. The police, although publicly more relaxed, still couldn't erase the name BTK from their minds. And the public, though not openly admitting it, knew that there was always the possibility that he would strike again. But the most puzzling question, the one we all tried to answer, was, how did Rader hide so well? How could he live such a normal life during those years of silence? This is where the mind of a serial killer like BTK becomes particularly disturbing. His ability to compartmentalize, to divide his identity in such an extreme way, is what allowed him to continue without raising suspicion. During those years, Rader perfected the illusion of being an ordinary man. Every smile he offered to a neighbor, every time he shook hands with a friend at church, was another layer in the mask he had built. And that mask was so perfect, so impenetrable, that no one could have imagined that behind it was a killer who had already tortured and murdered multiple people. The years of silence were a strange period for the city. Though the tension had eased, there was always an echo of fear in the air, a kind of latent uncertainty that no one could fully shake off. People still wondered if BTK would return. And in the meantime, Dennis Rader continued building his life, adding more bricks to his facade of respectability. It was a macabre game that only he knew he was playing. In the end, the calm held. Years passed, and BTK became a ghost, an urban legend, a name occasionally mentioned in family gatherings, whispered with worried glances. But during that time of silence, the tension only grew within him. Dennis Rader, the man who quietly sat in his home, was waiting. It wasn't a matter of if he would kill again, but when. And it was that tension, that anticipation of what would come next, that made those years of silence so unsettling. Because even though BTK seemed to have disappeared, those of us who had followed his story closely knew the monster hadn't gone away. He was simply waiting for his next move. The return of the monster, new crimes and arrogance. I remember when the news began to spread again through Wichita. After more than a decade of apparent peace, the headlines once again mentioned BTK. It was as if the monster we had all tried to forget had come back from the past to torment us once more. For many, it was unimaginable. How could someone resume a life of crime after so many years of silence? Dennis Rader, or BTK as he preferred to call himself, had returned. What shocked me most wasn't just the fact that he started killing again, but the way he did it. It was as if his thirst for control, power, and violence had multiplied during those calm years. Not only did he strike again, but he did so with impressive arrogance. It was as if the time that had passed had merely been a pause for him, a preparation for an even more imposing return. The murder that marked his return was cruel and calculated, but what surprised most was how he began communicating with authorities and the media again. BTK didn't just want to kill, he wanted everyone to know that he was behind those crimes. Once again, letters began arriving at the police station, filled with disturbing details and deliberately misleading clues. But there was something different this time. Rader seemed more confident, almost invincible. He knew he had managed to evade the authorities for so many years, and now his arrogance pushed him to play with them even more. In one of his letters, he referred to himself as smarter than them. For BTK, the killings were not just a means to satisfy his dark impulses, but also a game. A game of power, control, and superiority over the investigators and society. The arrogance in his words was palpable, and the most terrifying part was that he seemed to enjoy not only the act of killing but also the fact that he had managed to deceive everyone for so long. His return wasn't just a threat to more victims' lives, but a declaration that he was still a master of deception. I remember feeling a mix of disbelief and horror when I read the letters that arrived at the police station. How could someone be so audacious? There was something deeply unsettling in how BTK viewed himself. Not just as a serial killer, but as an untouchable figure, a predator who played with the police as if they were pawns on his board. That sense of control motivated him, fed him. Each letter was a taunt, a challenge to the authorities who had sought him for so long. One of the most disconcerting details of this period was how BTK, upon resuming his crimes, showed no sign of remorse or hesitation. While his public life remained that of an ordinary man, his private life continued to be a hell of violent fantasies. He didn't just kill, he meticulously documented every murder. Photographs, drawings, detailed notes. It was as if he was creating some kind of macabre autobiography. And I couldn't help but wonder what was going through his mind during those moments. What made him return after so many years? Perhaps, during those silent years, he had accumulated an internal tension, a growing need to relive the intense emotions his crimes brought him. Or maybe his desire for notoriety and power had reached a critical point. Whatever his motivation, one thing was clear: his arrogance made him more dangerous than ever. The press also played a role in his return. BTK wanted to be remembered, wanted to be feared. And every time his name appeared in the news, it fed his ego. The media, unwittingly, became part of his game. And he, like the master of ceremonies, delighted in every headline that spoke of his atrocious acts. But something was changing. While BTK felt invincible, his arrogance was also working against him. In his desire to be recognized, and his need to be the center of attention, he began making mistakes. Every letter, every message, was a clue the police analyzed meticulously. And though Dennis Rader believed he was still in control, he was slowly revealing more of himself than he imagined. This return of BTK was not only a resurgence of his killer side, but also a turning point in his story. As authorities pieced things together, the net around him was tightening, though he didn't know it. In his arrogance, he thought they would never catch him. But what he didn't realize was that in his desire to prove himself the perfect killer, he was sowing the seeds of his own downfall. The monster had returned, but his arrogance would soon betray him. The fall of BTK, the fatal error. What strikes me most when I think of BTK's fall is how ironic it was. After years of evading the police, creating a perfect facade as the ideal neighbor, and carrying out his crimes with meticulousness, it was his arrogance that finally brought him down. For decades, Dennis Rader had been almost untouchable, playing the role of a stealthy predator who never left a trace. But everything changed when he made a nearly childish mistake, driven by his insatiable need for recognition. I remember that moment as if I had lived it firsthand. BTK had once again started sending letters to the police, as if he wanted to remind them that he was still out there, lurking. But it wasn't just a simple letter that led to his capture. It was something more ridiculous, a question. Rader, in his desire to be admired and feared, asked the police if they could trace a floppy disk. He wanted to send them one with more details about his crimes, but before doing so, he wanted to ensure they couldn't use it against him. The detectives, with a mix of surprise and disbelief, replied that no, they couldn't trace a floppy disk. And he believed them. That was the fatal mistake. A simple act of misplaced trust in his own enemies, a blunder based on the arrogance of someone who believed himself invincible. The floppy disk Rader sent to the authorities contained more than just information about his crimes, it contained his own downfall. Upon reviewing the disk, investigators discovered it had been used previously at a church by a man named Dennis. From there, the investigation moved quickly. Soon, detectives arrived at the home of Dennis Rader, the man who had terrorized Wichita as BTK, the monster who lived among us. The fall of BTK was as abrupt as it was unexpected. What had started as an investigation with no concrete leads ended with a simple technological error. His desire to play with the police, to keep his legacy alive, was what led to his end. Thinking about the double life of Dennis Rader, known as BTK, remains a disturbing enigma. How someone could live two such opposite existences without one spilling into the other is a mystery that haunts me every time I reflect on his case. On one hand, he was the ideal neighbor, the president of his church, a respected man in his community, and an apparently devoted family man. On the other hand, he was a ruthless killer who enjoyed the power over life and death, stalking his victims with a coldness that defies all human logic. What's most frightening isn't just the brutality of his crimes, but how normal he seemed. It's the duality, the contrast between the man who shared meals with his neighbors and the monster who meticulously planned the next murder. People trusted him. His children, his wife, his friends, all saw him as an ordinary man, perhaps even a role model. And yet, for years, he had hidden his true self under that mask of normalcy. Can we ever really know the people around us? That is the most chilling question left by the BTK case. We think evil has a face, that it's something recognizable, easy to detect, but Rader taught us that reality is much more complex. Evil can hide behind a friendly smile, a family hug, or a community leader. The story of BTK is a warning, the monster isn't always far away. Sometimes, the horror hides behind the most familiar faces. And that's the most unsettling thing of all. In the end, Dennis Rader's double life shows us that evil doesn't just hide in the shadows, but also in plain sight, in the most ordinary lives. What do you think? Do you know someone whose life might hide such a dark secret? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments.